Hey guys, so for this video, basically I surveyed the players in the Tearlaments Facebook and Discord groups just to gather their thoughts in terms of, the key strengths and weaknesses and much more about Tearlaments. So definitely a huge thanks to all of you that responded to this survey. 102 players responded, which is actually a record for this type of video, and I've been doing this kind of video for all the other meta-related strategies, and I'll be continuing to do them moving forward. So definitely go check out those videos, and also you can certainly follow me on Twitter to make sure to not miss out on any future surveys. And as always, definitely go check out those discount codes on Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies such as those Team Sam sleeves on tsx1.com. I'll link all of those down below. So let's get started in terms of how the pilots rate the difficulty of playing this deck, and it was at about 8, which is actually quite high compared to the other decks that I've surveyed so far, and it is kind of understandable, especially during Tier 0 format when, most players were playing Tearlaments. I was certainly on that bandwagon as well, and it's definitely a big brain deck, especially when it comes to, like some of your line of play depends on, what you mill and also in what order that you mill, and certainly can make it very, very non-linear, which we'll get to very shortly. Now, another new question I added into this survey is, how would you rate the consistency of this deck, which admittedly, compared to other decks, Tearlaments, that is definitely a little bit more trickier to respond, just because, as mentioned earlier, it's kind of a quote-unquote casino deck, and it does depend on, what you mill and also what you mill in what order, right? So at the same time, despite the limit of the Shizu cards, the limit of the Tearlament names, the deck still does put itself in a relatively consistent position to be able to hit cards well. But again, I do understand that there are sometimes you do have some really, really bad mills, plus a bad hand, which can really go sideways for you. So I do understand, and it is a bit trickier to respond to this question for Tearlaments in particular. In terms of, what tier would players would categorize Tearlaments, and 2/3 put it at tier 1, which I think is kind of a safe position to put at this point. Keep in mind, when I initially did this survey, it was actually about a week ago, which I guess is like a few days after Dortmund. So perhaps, if we give it a bit more time, and especially after Age of Overlord with, the Horus stuff coming, which, again, like who knows if if most players will actually even use that package or not, but that was not part of this video. But you know what, for the most part, I think it is fair to put it at tier 1. I don't know why people put it at Rogue. I don't think it definitely belongs there at this point. Now, in terms of, what are the key strengths of Tearlaments, I tried my best to summarize the key themes that were mentioned in the survey by the players, and the first is just like the variety of type of interruptions that they have, and this is kind of like the playstyle I certainly enjoy myself as well, although Tearlaments, again, was a bit too big brain for me, but at the same time, they have a lot of interruptions to monsters that say they have potentially like Omni Negates to, like the Grapha or like Toad, Baron, but they also have really strong back row, in-engine back row at that, and that is, something like Select, which is like a permanent imperm, you have even like a Cram that's an Omni Negate, and even like Grave Disruptions like the Medora as well as Keldo. Of course, they are fortunately limited now, and perhaps, argument for them to just be banned outright, but just being able to shuffle back opponent's cards or even your own, it can be very detrimental against a lot of other strategies. Great against, kind of like destruction or send to graveyard by effect kind of removals, right? So for example, you have something like Unchain going hard right now, and they do a lot of popping, and if you pop Tearlaments, they're going to start fusing away. So compared to a lot of the other decks that I've surveyed, where a lot of times players mention how the weaknesses of that said deck would be something like, their bodies getting destroyed, and that being a weakness, but that is certainly kind of like a strength for Tearlaments instead. Being able to play on the opponent's turn is also a key strength. For example, even just off of like a Scream, you can mill a few cards if your opponent like summons something, and then that could potentially snowball into a lot of things and summon more interruptions. And even like Havness on the opponent's turn is always very nice. Of course, fortunately, it is put to 1 now. And lastly, just, kind of like that non-linear style of play. It does have a very, very high ceiling depending on, your pilot skill level. And it also makes it kind of hard for your opponent to predict sort of like the plays that you're going to be making, especially because it is, again, dependent on like kind of like the mills and in which order. Now, some other questions I'd also ask is, just like being able to rate the deck's ability to go first. 8.8, that seems pretty high. Of course, this is actually the first time I'm asking this question in this type of survey video, so I don't have any comparison at this point, but I suspect this is pretty high even compared to other decks. Now, in terms of the deck's ability to go second and break boards, and this also technically includes, the deck's ability to play non-engine. Now, Tearlaments is, of course, a bad example of that because they don't actually have much space for non-engine, but, let's say certain other decks might have a lot of space for, like, hand traps, which technically, encompasses its ability to be able to go second. Anyways, in terms of Tearlaments in particular, players rated as about 7.2. Again, I don't really have a comparison because this is the first time I'm asking this question on this type of survey video, but you know what, 7.2, that seems pretty good to me. They did mention in the comments that the deck does have a pretty good in-engine way to like break boards as well, especially with a lot of their effects potentially snowballing. Now, in terms of the typical end board that the players end on with this deck, I asked this question with a lot of the survey videos for other decks. For Tearlaments in particular, again, this is very difficult because it is dependent on kind of like the mills, although there are of course certain cards that they really try to focus on ending on. So instead, I'm going to try to more so focus on cards just in general that you should know in terms of what can potentially end up on their turn 1 board. So of course, you know, the field spell, they might get lucky and have like a Medora or Keldo into the grave as well, which not only serve as, you know, shuffling like your cards or their own cards, but on top of that, if they do have Planet on top of that, they can like trigger a pop, which can be very detrimental in terms of, you know, being able to pop whether your monsters or a back row. And on top of that, the field spell does provide like a 500 attack boost. Now of course, we also have the Tearlament specific back row cards, and you have something like, let's say, Sirlik, which is probably the most common one that they're trying to get to, which essentially serves as like a permanent imperm. But on top of that, being able to send like a Tearlament monster to grave can potentially trigger some fusions as well. They also have like the Meta Noise, which essentially serves as like a Book of Moon. And then you of course have like a Scream, which can also reduce the opponent's monsters by 500. So combining that with the Planet 500 boost, then, you know, that creates 1,000 attack point difference, which is pretty big actually. And on top of that, Scream can of course mill 3 if your opponent summons a monster and they have a Tearlament monster, and, you know, that can also snowball things. Of course, I'm not saying that they have all of this on their typical end board, definitely not. Again, it's very hard to do a typical end board for Tearlaments, so I'm just kind of outlining the specific Tearlament Shizu cards that you just have to at least be aware of. Of course, Rukalos is another one which can serve as a monster negate. The interesting thing with Rukalos though is that if the players are not running the King of the Swamp package, then they're probably not actually they're not going to be able to go into Rukalos, so that is something to keep in mind. And then of course, post side, they are probably putting in the Crime, which is a counter trap and serves as an Omni negate as well. And now, while most likely not on turn 1, sometimes they do, but something you also have to be aware of in Tournament Tearlament monsters is the Kaleido Heart, which can serve as a spin back as well. So definitely keep an eye out for that one. Now, of course, there are some other non-Tearlament cards that you have to be aware of that can also come on top of these other cards, and that is like, let's say, for example, some Omni negate options are available, such as the Totally Awesome that can come through the Bahamut Shark. They also can make Baron as well, especially with Diviner being a tuner. And then you also have like the Graph of Fusion, which can, for the most part, is also an Omni negate, except it's maybe not as flexible as Baron or the Toad. And then on top of that, you have some other interruptions, you know, something like Beatrice or Time Thief Redoer, which really can trigger like fusion summons on like the opponent's turn essentially. And, you know, you have something like Winda, which can be a very problematic floodgate. And then of course, even IP Masquerena, especially post Age of Overlord, they can use this and go into like something like SP Little Knight, which also serves as an additional interruption. So now let's go through the hand traps that the Tearlament players said that it impacts your deck the most, and you can kind of use this as like a side deck guide as well. And of course, the number 1 card is Dimension Shifter, and so this is very detrimental for a deck that's focused on sending cards to the graveyard. Now, previously in Tier 0 format, you know, because the Shizu cards were 3 and also the Tearlament names were at 3, they could very consistently make Baguska even under Shifter, which could be problematic to a lot of different decks, especially those decks that actually played Shifter. But nowadays, with, you know, all of those cards being put to 1, they can't make Baguska consistently anymore, so Shifter goes really hard. And of course, Bestial and Crows also really good, just being able to stop the fusion summons by just banishing those tier names. And Bestial Magma in particular, of course, is very nice because you can also add something like Druid's Worm, whereas compared to, let's say, in an Unchained matchup, usually Druid's Worm is better. You know, Droll is interesting because they actually mentioned it's sort of like hand dependent, but you know what, if you're a deck that has a lot of non-engine space and you're flexible, then you might as well throw those Drolls in as well. Ash is interesting because, you know, by reading the comments on the hand trap section, you would think that Ash was scored actually quite high, but at the same time, I kind of get it because I did ask, you know, which hand traps impact, you know, the most, right? And of course, Shifter, Bestial, Crows are definitely the most impactful. Ash, but I think I would say is still quite good against Tearlaments, especially to stop that, you know, Kelback or a Guido Mill. That Mill 5 can just really snowball things, and you just want to be able to stop that. Bell is kind of interesting. They definitely mentioned that while it can be good because, for example, let's say, you know, in theory, it can technically stop like the Tearlament fusion summons, or let's say even like the Grave Shufflers, stop that. But in terms of at least the summoning part, you know, they said that they can very easily like chain block as to not get affected by Bell. For example, you know, let's say any of like the Tearlament back row, like let's say Scream, it adds like a trap, right? And so you can always use that at the last of the chain, so you can protect that fusion summon from Bell. Nibiru is also interesting because if they play Rukalos, so as in, you know, they play the King of the Swamp package, and Nibiru is not very good, right? Rukalos can just negate it, and then Rukalos just comes back as well. But if if they don't play the King of the Swamp package, they did say that they cannot play as freely through Nibiru, but at the same time, I think it's hit or miss. Imperm Veiler, I think against Diviner on imperming the Diviner can be pretty impactful if they didn't really have any extenders, so you just have to like pray that they don't do anything else. And of course, if you need any of these hand traps or even board breakers or staples or whatever, you can certainly use my code Hakuna5 for 5% off at Card Brawlers or Tier 0 games, and you can certainly check those out in the description below. In terms of the board breakers that are most impactful against Tearlaments, they actually mentioned a lot of like the tributing cards, like let's say Lava Golem, Sphere Mode. Being able to tribute those off without triggering those Tearlament fusions is always very nice, and they do need like their Tearlament names for like their back row to actually be live. On top of that, Evenly Match was also a very common one that was mentioned, especially because they mentioned that sometimes they just cannot actually get into an Omni Negate and set that up, and Evenly Match can go very hard. But again, post side, you do have to take into account that they probably have access to Crime, which is an Omni Negate. The Book of Eclipse can also be pretty good. Again, they do need like their Tearlament names on the field, or at least they have to be face up at the very least. But at the same time, if they have something like Beatrice or Time Thief Redoer, they did mention they can always like trigger their effects, and then they get booked, and then like in a separate chain, you'll be able to trigger those fusion summons as well. So something to keep in mind. Super Poly, I would say it kind of depends. It's again kind of depends on the build. Like if they have Rukalis up, Super Poly is not that amazing, right? Because Rukalis is still an interruption you have to deal with. But if you were to Super Poly it away, like it's just gonna come back anyways. So I would say it kind of depends. And then in terms of let's say like Dark Ruler can also be very good. They do have a lot of monster interruptions again, but you do have to keep in mind of the Crime. Cosmic Cyclone, I'm surprised it was this low. I do think that it is quite good against something like, let's say like Select. You want to just be able to banish it so that you don't actually destroy it and trigger its add. And then something like Feather Dust and Lightning Storm, I do understand being able to blow their back row, they're going to be able to add a lot of cards. At the same time, I would technically argue it's kind of like dependent on the deck that you're playing. Sometimes like your deck might not be able to play through a permanent impermanent Select, and you just have to Feather Dust them. Sure, they get the add, but you know what, you might be able to at least play and actually have a chance anyways. And finally, in terms of the Floodgates that the Tearlament player said that was the most impactful against their deck, D-Barrier was definitely at number 1. They also again said that it kind of depends on the build, because if they're not playing King of the Swamp package, then they have more Xyz and Link plays. D-Barrier, like unlike Branded where they actually locked into like only fusions, that doesn't apply to Tearlament, so they do have a variety of other plays available, but D-Barrier can still be pretty strong in a predominantly fusion oriented strategy. Rivalry is another good one because they do have a lot of different monster types, so forcing them to stick to one type is kind of hard. Summon Limit is just kind of more generic, really applies to like most decks that are not just purely back row decks. Goes in Match is also kind of nice. They're largely Dark and Water. Anti-Spell, they said it's kind of hand dependent. Of course it can like really slow things down in terms of like the Planet, the Scream, or even like let's say like Foolish Burial Goods. But for the most part, a lot of these Floodgates that are not like lingering, if they have access to like the Grave Shufflers plus the Planet, they can pop these cards, right? Like Scale Drain, Grave of Super Ancient Organism, things like that. Even there can be definitely not a good one against Tearlaments, because sometimes they're actually playing that themselves. So just things to keep in mind when it comes to like the Floodgates. And finally, in terms of the weaknesses that Tearlaments player felt about this deck, some of the key themes include, just like banish effects, of course, Shifter being the most dominant one, but, Bestial, Crows, banishing those names, really, really detrimental, especially when those tier names are at 1 now. On top of that, Dweller, just shutting down graveyard effects, during that tier 0 format, especially in the mirror, just being able to put out Dweller was really, really critical. And, Dweller is actually quite easy to make for a lot of decks, right? It is a rank 4. On top of that, the randomness, while it can also be a positive, as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, in terms of being able to it's very difficult to predict what the opponent's trying to make. At the same time, they did mention that sometimes the tier players can just lose it to itself on bad mills. And also just not a lot of space for non-engine. So if you see those topping Tearlament deck lists, really you're gonna see that like there's really mostly engine cards. Like the only like non-engine cards that you typically see are something like, let's say, Talents. And lastly, the deck is just very, very difficult to pilot. So, it's certainly something that I would not recommend to a new player, but at the same time, if you do get the hang of this game, it's something that I do encourage you to at least try out. I do think the deck is very, very interesting, can be very, very fun to play as well. But for now, I think it is certainly, if you want to do really well, like you do have to have a pretty high skill level to be able to deal with this strategy. Anyways, guys, that was it for the Tearlament breakdown. So definitely a big thanks to those of you who responded to the survey. I really appreciate the time that you spent to fill that out in such detail. This video definitely would not have happened without all of you. So, a huge thanks to the rest of you for watching the video. Big thanks to my Patreons, as always, for their continued support. Really means a lot. And, well, take care, guys.